The Zero was a fast and highly maneuverable aircraft, which in the first year of the war had no equal. However, its performance had been achieved by keeping weight to a minimum, and that meant no armor plate, self-sealing fuel tanks, or armored windscreen. By 1943, the Zero had been outclassed by the new generation of American fighters in speed, firepower, and protection. Although the Zero was a fighter, some Japanese commanders realized that it would just be capable of carrying a 550-pound bomb. Flown by a courageous and determined pilot, willing to ram an enemy warship, the bomb-armed Zero could become the most formidable weapon ever directed at an American fleet. Although by the war's end, many different aircraft types would be used in kamikaze missions, the fast and maneuverable Zero would prove exceptionally well suited to penetrating the defenses of even the most powerful carrier task force. The Mitsubishi Ki-21 bomber had first entered service with Japanese Army aviation in August 1938. The aircraft had spearheaded the bombing offensive in China and Southeast Asia, and at the time was as good as any twin-engine bomber in the world. Although by 1944 the Ki-21 Sally was obsolete and suffering heavy losses at the hands of Allied fighters, the aircraft remained in first-line service. In the Philippines, as part of a mixed force of Army aviation bombers, Sallies would operate alongside Navy aircraft as part of the Show 1 plan. In 10 months to September 1944, the Japanese Imperial Navy had lost more than 5,200 pilots, 42% of its aircrew. Most of these had been operating from land bases. As for the carrier pilots, the most highly skilled of them all, they had been virtually wiped out. The Japanese Army had also suffered catastrophic losses of aircrew, and at a time when aircraft production was up and substantial numbers were reaching the squadrons, there was a critical shortage of flyers. In Japan, both Army and Navy training schools had simplified their programs in the hope of producing more pilots in a shorter time. However, the consequence was a significant drop in proficiency. Chronic fuel shortages added to the problem. Flying time was drastically curtailed, and new pilots had virtually no combat training. The pilot problem was much worse for the carrier air groups. Normally, 400 hours in the air was needed before a trainee could even hope to master carrier operations. And pilots now came out of the schools with only 200. While both Army and Navy tried desperately to train the pilots they needed if they were to have any hope of defeating the next American invasion, the Japanese fleet near Singapore embarked on an arduous training program of its own. Particular attention was paid to anti-aircraft gunnery and night fighting tactics. The Japanese Navy had always come off best in night battles, and it was hoped that by the most careful preparation, even an enemy as powerful as the Americans could be outfought and humiliated. On September the 15th, 1944, General MacArthur's forces landed unopposed on Morotai in the Moluccas, one of the islands that was to be used as a staging post in advance of the Philippines operation. On the same day, Nimitz forces landed on Peleliu in the Palau Islands, intended as another staging post on the way to Leyte. The landing forces, the 1st Marine and 81st Infantry Divisions, had been led to expect little opposition on the Palau Islands. Instead, they faced 30,000 Japanese troops with a carefully planned defensive strategy. On Peleliu, the Japanese had transformed hundreds of caves into fortresses, and the Americans had to blast the enemy out of each stronghold in turn. In the end, the conquest of the Palaus would take more than 2 months, and the islands would play no significant part in the Leyte operation. Even as the fighting in the Palaus was still going on, the Leyte invasion force was already setting sail. On October the 14th, the last of the troop transports and warships of 7th Fleet left their anchorages in New Guinea, bound for Leyte Gulf, more than 1,200 miles away. The landings were to take place in 6 days' time. The American landings on the Palau Islands and Morotai in September 1944 were a sure sign to the Japanese that an invasion of the Philippines could not be far away. On October the 4th, radio monitoring detected the aircraft carriers of the American 3rd Fleet assembling. At the same time, in Moscow, the Japanese learned from the Russians of an American plan to bomb Formosa as part of a coming Philippines campaign. The Russians were America's allies in the European war, but ally or not, Moscow preferred that the United States did not win the war in the Pacific too quickly. On October the 9th, the Japanese Imperial High Command alerted its forces in Formosa and the Philippines. However, the show plan was not to be implemented at once. Because of the fuel shortages, Japanese commanders could not risk concentrating all Imperial forces, especially naval forces, until they were certain of exactly where the American invasion was to be. When the Americans had actually begun to land, then the great counterattack would be unleashed. Altogether, the American forces which were taking part in the Leyte operation numbered over 800 ships of all types, with 1,500 carrier aircraft to attack Japanese air and ground forces on the Philippines.